Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. Today we have Frank Pasciuti, and he is going to be talking about his book, Chrysalis Crisis: How Life's Ordeals Can Lead to Personal and Spiritual Transformation. Dr. Frank Pasciuti is the founder and president of the Associated Clinicians of Virginia, and comes with a whole host of other prestigious things there's just almost too long to read. You have so many, Frank. So
Sorry
welcome.
about that. Thank you for having me on your show.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show. I got to tell you that the last couple of the last month, I've been followed by winged animals,
Huh.
butterflies,
Hmm.
dragonflies, but particularly butterflies. I had a butterfly follow me around the lake. And as background, I'm going through massive amounts of transformation right now. I'm now formally an empty nester. I dropped my son off to college 2 weeks ago. And
Oh, I remember that.
yes. And so he's my last one. We had my eldest we dropped off 2 years ago, and then my youngest we just dropped off. And so I thought it'd be fun way, at least for me. I desperately need some help. And since you're a psychotherapist, perhaps you can help me as well as help our listeners
Oh,
by using this period as a way of talking about your material. Are you willing to play with me, Frank?
sure, sure. And listen, I remember that transition well in my life. I have three, and I remember I felt like, well, my baby birds flew away. What was I supposed to do now? It was a big change.
All right, so I want to hear about your when your three baby birds flew away. Like what? So there's you as just Frank, the person who's like Frank the dad, and then there's you as a psychotherapist. So how did you use what you've learned from your book, Chrysalis Crises, as a way of helping you through that transition?
Well, that's a great question because, if I examine the 10 areas that I identify in the book, I'd have to run through them and start realizing that one critical thing changed. The proportion of time I spent in the role and my identity as a father was dramatically changing. I mean, I was
Mm,
still and still am very involved in their lives, but since they went off to college, there's never been the kind of vigilance and involvement in all the things that we used to come and watch them
mm,
do, and so that was a change.
mhm,
And I think I also felt implicit permission to throw myself more into writing, which is what was part of what
mhm,
contributed to getting this book done. So other things came to the forefront. Being more
mm,
social,
mm,
reconnecting with friends who I had lost touch with, particularly those who didn't go on and have kids, and maybe those were we were just into different things. So there were ways in which I felt that was a transition from myself for sure.
mm, mm.
Um, yeah, but it was a change. It was a change.
Okay, so you've knocked down two. And so talk about let's actually loop back to the premise of your book that during these moments we actually have 10 broad areas of human growth. So can you kind of step us through what those 10 areas are? And I think we've hit on two of them in your example.
Sure.
One is identity and the other are social, but can you just generally kind of scoop back and like talk about those 10 broad areas?
Well, they're very broad, and you're right. And the first five I put in foundational, which are, after in the aftermath of a crisis. I mean, after you work through the initial impact, it would be premature to say, okay, what are we learning from this crisis while you're still, in the pain of it all. But I think there's a point where you pivot and you start looking at what is needed for me to help navigate my way through it. And sometimes you have, in terms of integrating it and healing, if it's a significant crisis,
Mm,
um, and I would look at with a given client. I have found over the years I've been doing therapy, like are there areas that maybe need to be shored up that are particularly lacking right now that help you make the transition. The first five I call foundational, which are very generally concerns about your physical world, which could be your body, it could be your finances, it could be shelter, it could be anything that has
mm,
aspect with your physical world, your
mm,
intellectual world, any things that need to be changed in terms of your thinking, your belief, any new information to be pursued, your emotions, which are usually the harder area of the five, because a lot of times certain feelings are easier to register and express, and identify. And then we move on to like social, which are there changes that are going to be required of me in terms of getting through this that I'll need to do further development in the social area of my life, and then moral, which may not have applicability here, but some people get in crises that are clearly, the result of losing sight of their moral compass.
Mm-hmm.
And then I move on to the second three. Well, after the first five, the next three are what I call more personal. Those would be one's identity, how you see yourself changing throughout life, because identity is like, that changes throughout the life cycle. And then intimacy. And what I mean by that is more the capacity to be open and share of yourself or make connection with people on an intimate level. And then the third in that area would be existential. And that certainly has applicability here, which maybe your meaning and purpose shift a little bit. Maybe a different meaning starts emerging or a different purpose starts emerging. And the last two are what I call transpersonal. And those are very specifically, sometimes people will come to see me in what we call spiritual emergencies. And it may be because they're actually having a psychic experience that scares them, or they've had a direct contact with spirit. They might have had an out-of-body experience where they're aware that their, awareness is outside their body. It's not tied totally to their brain. Or some people will come in and say they have beheld what appears to be the spirit of a recently deceased person, or they have had an out-of-body experience. Oftentimes, the ones that are in the last two, the intuitive, I call the first one in the intuitive development, and the last one, spirituality, usually a little more foreign to people. So they get frightened. They start thinking that maybe they're losing their mind or something. But oftentimes it opens them up to a dimension that if they haven't considered it before, it's certainly on the front burner at that point.
Okay, this is a perfect. This helps me actually map. I think this helps me map my last 22 years.
Okay,
Perfect.
wow.
Okay, so I'll tell you. And this is really helping me immensely just thinking about this. So my dad, I was busy working at a high-tech company at Microsoft, working my tail off. So much so that I didn't have a chance to see my dad very often, who was working his tail off on writing a book. It was an environmental handbook, like covering every single thing. It was his life's work. He spent his whole last year and a half writing this book, maybe 2 years. And the book is seriously like 5 inches thick. It's like a huge definitive resource of everything that you need if you want to make sure you have good environmental impacts on things that you're building and creating, which is a great worthy task. So he was working on this, and before writing the literally the last chapter of his book, he had a heart attack and died.
Oh,
And
sorry.
yeah, so and then 2 weeks, if he had lived, 2 weeks later, my husband was going to meet him for the first time and ask for my hand in marriage.
Oh, boy. What timing.
Yeah, so that was my that was my life ordeal, right? And I've always thought, like,
Yeah.
why did this happen to me? And I can look at your experiences, and maybe you can actually help knit together, because I'm sure this has happened to some of your clients. But spirituality, definitely. Like when he died, we actually had a light that would go off on our room in the middle of the night. I had
Mm-hmm.
no idea why. And then we unplugged the light, and it still went off. I was like,
Oh,
I
wow.
don't know what is happening. And then at his burial, I was thinking, I just hope it gets sunny. And the minute that happened, the sun came out. Or I wonder if you're
Wow.
with me now, Dad. And the minute that happened, two crows came and sat on the telephone pole and started cawing like crazy. And so I've had all
Wow.
these like deep spiritual experiences, that I thought, what the heck is happening? I don't
Yeah.
understand what is happening. And I think a part of me, why I even do this radio show, is to like, what else is out there? I don't get it. And I think I'd already had intuitive skills that I had put on the back burner. So when you go to the transpersonal, which are two of your growth areas, what do you find with some of your clients? Like, do they experience similar kinds of things, or what are they experiencing?
Very much so. Actually, I have one of the people I identify in the book who I work with. she was a very just like, hard science, no soft head thinking at all, and had this experience, which was traumatic for her. I like was literally the day after the night she and her fiance decided they were going to get married, and he drowns the next day,
Oh
and
my
it was
God.
blew her literally. I mean, it was the story when she told me. I was holding back tears. It was so raw for her. And yet, what scared her was she started having similar things. TV channel stations would change while she's watching TV, and the changer was like on a table about 5 feet away. She was having like feathers appear. There were things that she felt she had a sense of his presence in the room, and there were all kinds of synchronistic things going on, and she thought she was losing her mind. And then a lot of people come in with these transpersonal experiences. The first thing they want to know is, am I crazy? And I'll say, well, tell me what your experience is, because I am a clinical psychologist, and I think you're,
I can tell you if
half
you're
of the time,
crazy or not.
I mean, I do that for a living, but
Right.
most of the time if somebody comes in and says, I think I'm crazy, that's usually the first sign that they're probably not. Because if they thought they were, if they come in and they say, I think I'm Jesus Christ, that's different than if they come in and say, hi, I'm Jesus Christ. There's a certain processing ego that's still accessible. But you know what? But people have phenomenal experiences. I mean, psychokinetic experiences, which are the movement of objects. I mean, there's a story, even with Carl Jung sitting down with Sigmund Freud, where they were having a very intense encounter, and a bookcase broke, and Jung knew enough about that. He said it's going to happen again, and it happened again. The old oak bookcase is cracked. So the energy is there, and it can affect the physical world. And it's interesting. In my life, I have had many times animals, hawks, and things show up. And I think we're all swimming in the stream of consciousness, and however spirit, I believe, works to inform us, especially if you're intuitive, it sounds like you are, and you start, like surmising from impressions you're getting from around you or from within you, that you can get guidance or you can get confirmation or validation. And a lot of people, and if you don't want to be like so like out of it that you're not trying to use some discretion, but a lot of times people just don't pick up on these things, or they
Right.
discount them and dismiss them. But if you're open to it, there's a lot of ways in which they'll get messed. I have a number of people come and say to me, as a matter of fact, I was just at a wedding 2 weeks ago, and my cousins came up and said her brother's wife died recently, and said to me, I saw her. She came forward, and then this woman who died, her son's wife came up and said the same thing to me. He said, I saw my mother-in-law. She appeared to me, and I said, well, that's two people in the same family who have said they've had separate experiences with beholding the image of somebody who just died. And I don't think and both of them are very grounded. And so, and the research on that is, by the way, pretty high. A number of people will talk about impressions they receive or actual beholding the image of the person who died after they died.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to ask you. So, for me, there are these butterflies and all these winged creatures that seem to appear in my life. And since Chrysalis is your main concept in the book, tell me about like when you think of the butterfly and the process it goes from caterpillar to butterfly. How do you think that that's a metaphor for transformation?
Well, I was reading a story about this little girl, which I talk about in the book, who's watching this caterpillar, form a cocoon in the backyard in a tree, and then she sort of becomes enamored with it and watches the whole process. And then at one point, she goes back there and she sees the butterfly breaking out of the cocoon after it's been through its metamorphosis, or its own version of a meltdown, if you will. And so she's noticing it's snapping its wings and it's having trouble disengaging. And so she thought it might need some help, and she tries to help it. And of course, as we know, touching the wings, the butterfly falls to the ground and dies. And she was devastated. And she goes to see her mom, and her mom says, honey, that butterfly needed to struggle to disengage from that cocoon, because the struggle was not only needed to detach from the cocoon, but it strengthens its wings for flight. So I thought, that's a beautiful metaphor for the struggle we come out of when we're trying to work our way out of a crisis after we go through our changes. But if it's an area of our development that has, before the crisis, been lacking, and we need to develop it to integrate or heal from the crisis, then while it was a painful way to learn, there's been gain. Like, so we talk about in clinical work, pre-morbid state. Let's say somebody is just not very aware of feelings. They don't register them. They don't experience them. And, you lose somebody you love, and it's a very powerful emotional experience. Of course, you're going to have sadness. You're going to have fear. You might have anger. You may have all these feelings. And if you've been very cerebral and intellectual and out of touch with your feelings, you're still going to need to deal with those in the aftermath of that loss. So it may be that you have to bring this emotional component in your life up online, if you will, or develop it so you can do the work to finish the grieving. But in the aftermath, when you look back at that experience, you'll say, that was a pretty painful time, but I learned how to be aware of my feelings. Now, that's pretty significant for the rest of your flight through life. So that's one way in which it would work. There could be numbers of areas probably where you might have to adjust after the loss of a mate. But it might be also, in terms of, physical, it might be just learning how to manage money or make money or whatever, or just provide shelter. It could be social if you've been, you may need to come out of yourself more, whatever. So lots of ways.
I'm laughing, not because those things are laughable, but I was thinking about my son that I just launched. And I thought, he just doesn't know anything. I've tried, but he just he wasn't ready to receive the information, at least when I was ready to give it, which of course was last minute before he left, right? Which was bad on me. But nonetheless, I'm like, do you know how to make a deposit of a check? Things like that.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking, okay. Yeah. So I think that's true, the physical aspect of it. And I thought, I guess that is one area where it's foundational, like you said. He needs to figure these foundational pieces out, the physical piece and the emotional piece. And to me, it almost seems like I want to ask you, but to me, when I think about the things that you just mentioned, they're just it's really hard to navigate well if you don't have a proper foundation of these things. But what did you mean by foundational growth areas?
Well, I thought of them as foundational. You may remember from a course in psychology somewhere along the way, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If we don't have food and shelter, we're not going to be thinking about, our purpose is going to be very basic, stay alive. So in terms of existential issues, or we're not going to be thinking about some higher order needs.
Right.
We need to get and basically the acquisition of knowledge in the intellectual dimension. You need to learn how do you make a fire, how do you learn how to provide yourself with what you need for shelter and food.
Right.
It gets very basic, and same with emotions, because feelings are so prominent in our lives. If we're not learning how to be able to experience them or manage them, or socially. Think about how in the early stages of men's and women's development, how dependent we were on the community. So one needed to learn how to, socially learn to cooperate with others and work together for survival's sake, or morally.
Right.
In a civilized society, we have understandings. You just can't take my stuff, or you just have to so and so those are foundational, I think. And then you move on to, and then if you have the freedom to say, okay, so who am I anyway? And other than, and that can broaden. I'm a man, or I'm a boy, and I'm an Italian boy, or I'm from this place, and then it expands to the point where I'm I'm this being. I'm part of the world. I'm everybody's brother. I'm everybody's sister. We're all united in that sea of consciousness. So the expansion of identity goes. It's like we're gods in the making. I think Bergson said at one point, we're all sort of moving towards the divine.
I see. So it's almost, so if you use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's food and shelter, basic things, which are the foundational piece. Then there's love and connection, I think, is maybe next on the higher level thing. And then there's self-actualization. I think I'm collapsing,
right?
But and those kind of mirror your
those are good. Those exactly. And the self-actualization might be that we start when we have all those basic needs in a good place. What I do in the book is I go through all these different keys, the 10 of them, but then I cycle back and say, okay, so if indeed, as Teilhard de Chardin would say, we're all in the process of becoming, and we're all moving towards reunification with the divine, as he says it, then how do we make that connection? So it's if you start meditating, one of the things you need to not be preoccupied with is the physical, right? You need to learn how to quiet that. So if you're worried, you're thinking about money, or you're thinking about all kinds of other things, you're distracted. If you don't believe that there's a capacity that you have to merge and to have these things. You might need to change your education. You may need to learn more so you can
Mm,
have more trust in the process. If you're always dealing with undercurrents of emotional turbulence, when you try to meditate, it's going to break through. It's going to be saying, okay, now that you're not working all the time or preoccupied doing other things, these feelings that you've not resolved about all these events in your life are going to come to the forefront. That's not bad. That's kind of a purgation process, but it requires getting your emotional life in a place where you can be calm and centered. Same with social. There might be some element of benefiting from working with groups in meditation, or
mm,
and then the moral area is, if you have any conscience at all, it's going to probably bother you when you're trying to meditate, just like it may bother you when you try to sleep. So
mm,
these are areas that you'll come back to in terms of cycling back. I call it,
mm,
using the keys at a higher octave for a higher purpose.
mm. Yeah, so
But they require.
oh, go ahead. So
I'm
I'm,
sorry.
I'm,
Go ahead.
I'm thinking about my own life, and not to be so self-centered. Hopefully, I'm not a narcissist. However,
No, you're not. You're
just
taking risks here. You're taking risks. You're putting your stuff out there. That's an intimacy.
okay, good. Thank you. Now I can
It's a good
actually
thing.
be. Now I can say,
It's
"Hey,
a good
psychotherapist
thing.
said I am not." So if you're going to call me that, like, I don't think you can. All right. So I was thinking about when you're sharing those foundational pieces. So, when our kids were first born, I would say I was largely unconscious. Like this tsunami hit me, and I drowned for about 3 years. And then finally, I floated on the top of the water, going, "Okay, what? Now what?" And so this time
Yeah.
around, as I'm going through life and a lot of the spiritual books, they talk about a period when you're a householder, where you're learning about the practical aspects of these five foundational things, and you're learning. I'm going to actually reframe this. Hopefully, I'm not.
No,
This
it's
isn't
great.
congruent with your foundational pieces, but all right. So I'm thinking about CJ with her husband raising two kids. It used to be CJ, striving to like go get a job and like be important work, whatever. Okay. Then it was CJ as a mother. And it's like another life cycle in which I'm kind of thinking about, okay, what does the physical aspect of it? Do I let my body go to hell as I'm working, as I gain 40 pounds? Or do I stay on
Hmm.
top of it? Intellectually, the beliefs that I had about work and what was important to me are changing because there's a challenge because I have kids. Emotionally,
Right.
I realize like when my kids cry, I just lock down and like cannot deal with it. I'm like, stop crying. Like here's what I'm thinking in the back of my head: stop crying, stop crying, stop. And it's like, wow, if you're relating to your emotions like that, that's not super helpful for your kids. And then I learned about how I'm Asian and how like I basically learned that behavior of stuffing down on my emotions and how I had to grow in order to support my son. Socially, all my social connections changed and reformed and then became family focused. And then morally, it's like just figuring out like what are our key values as our family and what does this organization, what does the
Right.
organizational culture look like as a family? Because that's exactly what you're doing. And so I can see that those are things that I can now look and go, oh yeah. And then my identity
Hmm.
shifted from being like corporate person on, going up the track to like going the track to nowhere, and being a mom
Hmm.
and just basically wiping butts and wiping noses and butts and driving a lot and working part time. And then the key part that I really grew is intimacy and knowing,
Hmm.
to say, I'm sorry. I screwed up. I'm sorry. To my
Yeah.
kids, to my husband, to like take accountability for my feelings that I wasn't always right. And in the meantime, that whole thing, like I said to my kids, I said, I would not have as much meaning and purpose in my life if it weren't for you guys. I realized like
Beautiful.
all the pissing and moaning I did in the beginning because I had such a hard time. I was like that butterfly letting go of its wings was
Yeah.
huge because I grew spiritually, I grew intuitively, all those kinds of things. It's a really good map. Frank, it's a good map.
Oh, CJ, I could not have articulated that better. That was great. No, that really is. And you know what's beautiful about it? Because I've also been in a marriage for 39, 38 years and raised 3 children. And I remember speaking to an uncle, one of the 2 people I dedicated the book to, who didn't marry, but he was very spiritual, and I'd have to say he was my spiritual teacher. And I said, and I remember thinking, well, and I was in the early years, I was being influenced by 1950s and 60s Catholicism, and I remember there were priests and they didn't marry. And I remember him saying to me, "There's things maybe you need to learn," because I was saying, I think I'm going to probably, get married someday. I kind of see that in my future. But what's beautiful? We learned these things. These are the things. I don't know if you got to the point in the book where I talk about spiritual bypassing. It's almost as if to say, I don't want to have to deal with all those other areas in my life. I want to go right to being a spiritual person. Right. And then you realize, guess what? There's a lot of work to be done. It's wonderful to have a sense of faith and spiritual awareness, and even to be open to some of these intuitive faculties. But when we're really talking about evolving and growing, so much of the work gets done in those other foundational and personal areas, like you just so well expressed. I mean, there's where you have those life experiences, which helps us grow and master in those other areas, so they can serve us as we aspire to those higher levels.
Yeah.
But if we don't, and we try to run off and try to be some spiritual person, and we never learn. I've known people, for instance, I've seen in my practice, people who've, gone into like different kinds of roles and spiritual roles, but you can almost see that developmentally there's a lot of things they haven't come to terms with, and they almost try to evade that by running off into some spiritual track or something like that. There's nothing wrong with them, but you're bringing an undeveloped earlier part to try to, it's almost like you're being held back by lack of development in those other areas. But there's nothing like kids to teach you emotions, right? I mean, how much can your heart be open? I remember thinking, absolutely. My mother always used to say to me, "You don't learn how to curse until you have kids." I said, well, maybe I learned a little beforehand, but they sure do have an open road to your heart.
Well, it does. So in tantric, and this is not like have sex tantric. In tantra, which means that you learn through you do spiritual development through living life. Householder is definitely part of that path because of all the reasons that you mentioned. Because you have to learn about caring about someone more than you care about yourself. Like, almost every parent I know would say, if like it came to getting shot or saving my kid, I would say, if I had to get shot and save my kid, I would do it. It's like you have that kind of love for someone else more than yourself, and that doesn't.
It's a powerful love.
Yeah, it is. It's like, where does that come from? You don't know it until you raise kids and you realize that you love someone that dearly that you would sacrifice your whole life for them. It's that kind of thing that you learn, which is actually a beautiful thing, that if you don't raise kids, if you don't have a householder path, and it can be, I don't think you have to raise kids. You can actually have a psychotherapist practice where you care so deeply about your children, or be a teacher where you care so deeply about others that you're willing to give everything. I'm not trying to be a big proponent for families, but for me,
no, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah. So the next part
is to love another. Yeah.
Okay. So the next part is the renunciate. So after in the tantric path, you go to the renunciate path, where you let go of the material and physical. And I'm wondering, based on your foundational pieces, and you've gone through this process yourself when you moved to, being an empty nester. I don't know if you think about a renunciate path, but it's about letting go of the material so that you can develop in those last two areas, a transpersonal area. But can you talk a little bit about your own personal process and how that kind of rolled out for you?
Sure, and actually, it's great that you're talking about the tantric path, because towards the end of the book, I try to take a shot at it, like many people are doing these days, which is understanding consciousness. And when you think about that whole expanded consciousness dimension of spirit and higher degrees of spirit, I think of the tantric notion that spirit descends down, if you will, through mind, and mind splits into both, on one side, the ego and physicality, and on the other side, the transpersonal and subtle. I love that, because there's that sense of saying that I need to master, but also let go of the primacy I give to physicality and ego, and be more open and able to be more open to the
Mm.
transpersonal and the subtleties
Mm.
of both spirit and or those psychic functions, which kind of help us start learning about different ways of viewing time and space, and the fact that we have a direct experience where our awareness can be separate from our identification with our body and our brain. But in terms of my own path, I totally share what you're saying. I think the love I have for my children, the depth of that, there would be, I totally understand how you would step in front of a bullet for your kids. I mean, it would just be instinctive to say that I love my children and the desire to preserve their life more than my own. I really believe that, I've never faced that threat in my life, but I just have a sense that, of course, I would do that.
Mm.
Um, in terms of my own, I think my children have taught me a lot. I just had two of them get married this year, and one of them
Oh,
asked, and both of
congratulations.
them, yeah, thanks. I had all three now are married and off and running in
Wow.
careers, so I feel like I'm at an exhale point with regards to that. But now I got grandkids coming, so I'll start worrying all over again. But it's only I get one removal from it, but it's beautiful. I actually love the idea of having grandkids and just thinking, I got this is wonderful to watch it again.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think with my children I learned so much from them. I even quoted it when one of my children's weddings. I said those Wordsworth when he says the child is the father to man. I remember hearing that in my high school English class and thinking, what the heck could that mean? And I thought, you know
Mm.
what? Our children teach us. They're the fathers of
Mm.
us. They're
Mm.
the ones who teach us. And so
Mm.
I would say, and not again, that I think there's many ways to learn those lessons, and I'm not advocating that everybody has to have kids to learn them, but certainly the love and the motivation for me to be humble, to learn to admit when I was wrong, or trying to be my best self so I don't pass on, hand me down neuroticisms to my kids or things.
Mm.
So those are ways I think that having children for me helped. And I guess in the aftermath of then moving on, I was thrown back in my relationship with my wife, and it was like,
Mm.
oh, I discovered my girlfriend again,
Yeah.
and and there was that element also of saying, okay, we're still here for a purpose, and
Mm.
my purpose, so much of it may have been being one of the providers in our family, but I think I shifted back. I know that this book was something I was thinking about writing 20 years ago, and I
Wow.
knew what it was going to entail. And I saw it. At one point, I was really involved. I was traveling the world, going to work with shamans and past life therapists and you name it, all the different things that I had heard about. I wanted to experience and see what would help order and
Mm.
what didn't. But at the point I was thinking about writing the book, I actually already had about 100 pages written. I had a
Wow.
friend who was a publisher, and he said, "You're going to really need to be willing to throw yourself into this." And at that point, I was coaching my daughter's basketball team and my son's soccer team, and I was totally enmeshed in my family. And I remember just thinking, "Not now. I can't do this now. My
Mm.
priority. This is not. This can't be my priority. I did not want to split that, at least for me at the time,
Mm.
because I
Mm.
also had other things like a practice going and things like
Right.
that. But I think
Yeah.
you shift around, and when your kids move on, sometimes you can fall back into things because all of a sudden those years go by and you realize, hey, I'm still here and I still got plenty of juice and still have plenty of interests, and I can throw myself back into those things in a more focused manner.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've
I
noticed
don't know
with
if I
my
answered.
friends, who are going through this empty nesting. I mean, so I said to my girlfriend, "What do you want to do when your daughter leaves?" And she's like, "I have always wanted. I love working. I want to go back to work, and I want to press it pedal to the metal till 65 or later, or until I drop dead. Preferably the third." Like they just want to
Yeah,
squeeze the juice out
good.
of working. They love working. They love collaborating. They love we're in Seattle, so they're like, "I want to go back to Amazon." I was like, "Really?" That is the last thing I want to do. It's so interesting. I'm like, wow, I'm a free range chicken. I cannot be in a pen anymore. I'm like a stray cat,
Yeah,
whatever it is
right.
that is broken and cannot go back to whatever the
Yeah,
corporate existence is. I'm like, I can't follow a schedule. I'm a very
yeah,
disciplined person, but the thought of going back to a schedule and having a boss and having meetings, it was just like the whole thing enervates me. And yet I see my girlfriend who's just like, I am chomping at the bit. So it's just interesting as both of us are reaching this closing of a chapter of a book, how our responses are so different. I mean, it's like, I
Yeah.
guess it's, I don't know if it's about your identity, or I'm not sure what it
It
is,
is.
but how would you, how would you, I mean, I'm noticing the difference in our in energy levels, desires, and intent. And my intention is, like you were saying, I view it in a slightly different frame, but very similar, which is that I have a Kundalini tantric practice. And so the belief is that you come as an individuated point of consciousness. And as that energy rises back up, as you go through your spiritual journey, it's to move from dual to non dual, to recognize that you're
Hmm.
one with consciousness, you're one with everything, you're
Right.
not separate. Actually, you've never been separate. You think you're separate
That's
because
right.
your ego thinks you're separate, but actually, you're one with
Right.
this beautiful divine presence. I just want to figure that out. And then I can do whatever else
Yeah.
afterwards. Like if I want to work, write a book,
Yeah. Yeah.
like I just want
Well,
to
what do they
focus
say?
that.
Yeah. What is it? Before and was it carry water, chop wood? Before enlightenment, after enlightenment, carry water, chop wood. It's just, but you do it differently. It's and I also agree. By the way, the tantric notion, I agree totally. I mean, the idea was the way in which that duality can get played out, but ultimately it is all one. I think we're moving
Hmm.
towards saying I want to move. I want to be able to expand my awareness and consciousness where I can identify with being one with everything, because that consciousness runs through everything.
Hmm.
And so when you see animals and hawks and things, and you start having all these synchronicities, you realize, wow, everything, even the material physical world, everything is all united through consciousness. No matter
Hmm.
how far down you go, it's
Hmm.
all vibrating energy and consciousness. And so I do think that when you start paying attention, as it sounds like you do all the time, you start seeing all these relationships. You're resonating with. I think it's a beautiful thing, and especially when you can experience it directly as you have, and I think it just affirms that it's all valid.
Yeah, I'm actually, so I'm going into the, like, thinking about V3, version 3.0. I'm a software person, so I was thinking versions. So I'm thinking about version 3.0. And it's interesting because you do think about every single one of these things. Like physically, I want to, like I've said over and over, like I'm doing everything I can to be the person who I'm like walking, I'm 95, boom, drop of a heart attack. Like I want to be walking all the way until I'm dead. Like that's my physical goal. And I'm
Right.
working towards that. And I guess intellectually, I just, part of what I'm realizing is I don't want to subscribe to all these societal beliefs that imprison me anymore. I don't, and I know what they are.
Yeah.
But and then
Yeah.
emotionally, I don't know about emotionally. Tell me about you. Like so, emotionally, what changed for you with your
Well,
kids leaving?
well, my kids, I think, would change. Well, all through the course of having children, from the years that they were in, more actively in my life as I was raising them, I just think I woke up to lots of feelings. Like I grew up in an
Mm,
environment where I guess as a typical guy in my generation, I wasn't as aware of my sadness. I mean,
mm-hmm,
cognitively, I knew it's okay for guys to cry, but I think somewhere along the way, due to some experiences I had as a kid, growing up in the inner city, uh, I just learned how to shut that off.
mm-hmm,
And unfortunately, when I wanted to be able to retrieve it, it wasn't exactly on demand.
mm-hmm,
And so I had to learn how to feel those feelings again. So and that was really important. Fear was another one for me. Like
mm,
anger, as classically and stereotypically, Italian families, we do anger pretty well. It's like there's no, there's lots of families, maybe, or lots of different cultures will have
mm.
okayness with
I'm laughing because
certain.
I love anger. This is my thing.
Yeah,
I could
anger
be
is like we're the
Italian.
Kentucky Fried Chicken. We do
Right.
anger. We do anger for sadness. We do anger for fear. We do anger for anger. But I had to learn how to experience those other ones too. And I think my kids contributed a lot to my
Mm-hmm,
softening and feeling the depth of just open heartedness.
mm-hmm,
And I think so. So when they left, I felt sad. I mean, I could feel it.
mm,
I remember I really did feel that. I remember, a road I used to go down all the time to the high school that my two youngest went to, and that I didn't go down that road anymore, literally and figuratively. And I remember one day
no.
making a turn thinking, I haven't gone down that road in a long time. I used to be like down that road like a couple of times a day for so many years. So anyway, there was some grieving that needed to be done, and I was glad I had the ability to do the grieving. But again, there was a certain amount of suffering there, and I think it opened me up to taking a look at my identity and maybe moving into other things. So,
Yeah.
the feelings. I think I remember in the early days when my kids were born, I told a friend of mine, I said, I feel like these little people are running around with my heart as if it were a vase, and I'm saying, please don't fall and break my heart, because I don't know if I'll get over it.
That's perfect. That's a perfect way of describing it. That's really
Yeah, you
interesting.
feel,
I think that for me, like as I'm rounding, if you view that what the world brings you at your next stage in your life during those pivot points is areas that you still need to, you said areas of development that still need to heal. I've worked a ton on my anger, but I haven't worked on my fear of certain types of things like fear, worry. As a parent, like all
right.
those, like, are they going to come home? What time is it? Are they going to come home? Are they okay? Did the job? What happened during your interview? It's like,
Yeah, yeah. I
it's like it's
understand.
not your life
It's
anymore.
hard.
It was never your life. It was always their life. Let
Yeah,
it go. That's the stuff that I'm
it's
having
tough. It's
problems
tough.
letting go of, right? Like
Sure. But you
worry,
know what?
doubt.
I mean, what do you go? What do you? What makes you? What soothes you? I think a lot of times is having a faith, a belief, a
Yeah.
trust
Yep,
that
I do.
we've infused them with the things we needed to. And it's not tangible. And when you get frightened, I think sometimes we just care. We don't want anything to happen to them. And I think
Yeah.
it's hard to let go and trust and have faith, and that we're not the only ones looking out for them.
Yeah,
That
that's a
there is a
perfect way
certain
of
guidance.
describing it. That's so perfect in describing we're not the only ones looking after them. One, just, if you don't go spiritually, you can go like there's divine, whatever, but it's like, don't you think they care about their lives a little bit more than you? Actually,
Yeah, yeah,
they care
yeah.
and they know and they're doing everything they can because it's their life. Hello. Um,
Yeah.
I love
And
that.
and we can't prevent them from suffering, and they're going to learn
No.
from their suffering too, even if it breaks our heart while they're doing it.
Yeah.
But you know what? We don't want to see it of course we don't want to see it in an inordinate amount, but but who knows? What's going to open them up? It's like we just don't know. We can fill them up with all our precautions and our wisdom as much as we can share it and listen to it, but they do need to learn from their own experiences, and that's we're all here for that. It's hard
Mm.
to step back and trust that sometimes. So I know for me.
Yeah, I think if there's an area of development, it's about letting go and knowing like, yeah, fear, it's basically fail fast. Like all I hope is that they fail fast. Honestly, because how
Yeah,
else are they going to learn?
move through that part of life real quick. Fail fast. Fail
Well,
and
that's
learn quick and get out the other side.
well, and like while I'm still alive and everything's good, it's my son took a software development class and the whole idea is fail fast. Like experience, learn, move, grow, experience, failure, learn, grow, it's like how can you actually make that a life how can you actually change to me it's a beautiful thing because it changes your relationship to failure because you cannot learn
Hey,
unless you've had
that's
failure.
right.
So
Isn't that
it's
great? That's great. I love it.
yeah, so I love the whole fail
Takes
fast.
the shame out of it. Takes the
Yeah.
shame out of it. It takes the
Yeah.
shame. It says it's almost a necessary ingredient for growth.
Yeah.
So it's going to happen. So
Yeah.
try to do your best, but learn from your failures. Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about the book and what you want people to get. I mean, we've talked a ton about, I think, of just learning about like what's in the book and, what's your greatest hope in terms of what people get out of the book?
Well, I mean, I think one of the areas that I really wanted to try to Pied Piper people into, if you will, is starting in the more conventional areas of the foundational and the personal. But I also would like for people to open up, those who are ready for it, to open up to the transpersonal, because I think there's a lot to be learned there. And I think there's a lot of skepticism and
Mm,
disbelief in a spirit dimension and in the fact that some of these sense, sensitive psychic functions are real.
mm-hmm.
And if anything, I mean, that not only can help us in our own lives, but I think when you have experiences that are that subtle and they seem to defy the way time and space work, it opens you up more to realizing, hey, it may not all be just about what I pick up sensorily, seeing,
Mm,
and touching, tasting, smelling, feeling, and stuff like that, but that I can start trusting my intuitive, functions. And so
Mm.
I know I've actually, I think for me, it was the reason those 10 keys are so broad because I was trying to get my arms around such a wide spectrum of inherent potentials that we all have. And I wanted to include the transpersonal and
Mm.
look at all of them through the lens of crisis because that helps
Mm.
amplify and isolate them. So that's what I would want people to do. I would want to say, look at the whole spectrum. Don't just, we're much more than meets the eye. And I think it helps people. Like, for instance, if when people have an experience of a near-death experience, they don't fear death as much. I mean, wouldn't that be
Mm.
beautiful? If
Mm-hmm.
people actually had the faith in recognizing, okay, even though the physical is most evident, and maybe I'm just so disproportionately focused on the physical because I am in a physical body. When I leave my body, I'm not going to just go poof and be gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a denial of death that leads me to believe that. It's that the mind and consciousness is energy and it's not going to be destroyed. And the same with time and space. Even when you fall into a deep meditation, you realize, you know, how time and space, causality, all these things change. So I think there's something to be learned about that as well as just in the basic areas of not only just learning intellectually, but, experiencing feelings and living a full life.
Mm-hmm.
I think those 10 keys are very broad in that, and sometimes when we reflect back, when we are in a space where we can reflect back, many times in hindsight, over a crisis we went through, we look back and say, wow, that was painful, but boy, I really did learn a lot about X or about myself in this area.
Yeah.
So, I guess I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
I don't think it's all random and, you know, it's just not all random. There's a purpose. We're here to grow and
Yeah.
we're going to do it.
Yeah. I think of it as we're here to experience life and to recognize that, we're both divine and human, right? Because we're going to fail, we're going to feel sad, but then we'll also recognize that, there's a simple beauty in a butterfly, struggling to get out of the cocoon. Um, I have another question for you as a psychotherapist that I'm really curious about. So, they
Sure.
talk about in spiritual development, and they talk about spiritual leaders, which you were talking about earlier about people who sometimes do spiritual bypasses. And that idea is basically like they want to move quickly to the road of enlightenment and they kind of like deny their feelings, do whatever. And they talk about that, and I can't remember who came up with the statement, but you have to show up, grow up, wake up, and clean up. And so when you were thinking
Mhm.
about the folks that you were talking about, does that seem, oh my gosh, you only have a minute, shoot. But can you tell me a little bit, in a minute or less, can you tell me how that resonates with the people that you've met on the spiritual path?
Yeah, no, I think they eventually realize that, they want to aspire, and it's very commendable to be spiritual people. And I say, don't give up that quest, but realize that, that if you want to stay buoyant on the sea of, spirituality, in other words, you got to get rid of some of these weights that are holding you back, which may be lacking development in those other areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have been talking to Frank Pasciuti about his book, Chrysalis Crisis: How Life's Ordeals Can Lead to Personal and Spiritual Transformation. Thank you so much.
CJ, thank you so much for having me. It was very enjoyable talking to you.
Thank you.
Went by, talk about time and space. It went by really quick.